In the grand tapestry of galactic civilization, where 47 different species had mastered faster-than-light travel and 32 had developed truly excellent coffee alternatives, the Hegemony Trade Consortium prided itself on being the most civilized bunch of resource appropriators the universe had ever seen. They didn't invade. They didn't conquer. They simply arrived with briefcases full of legal documents and politely explained why your planet would be so much better off under new management. The process was elegant in its bureaucratic brutality. First came the surveys, conducted by sleek vessels that could map every mineral deposit, water source and atmospheric composition from a comfortable distance. Then came the assessments, performed by teams of xenogeologists, who could calculate the exact monetary value of your world's crust down to the last precious metal atom. Finally came the negotiations, where civilized beings sat around mahogany tables and discussed relocation packages, while avoiding direct eye contact with the soon-to-be displaced natives. It had worked flawlessly for 3 centuries. The Hegemony's portfolio now included 17 garden worlds, 43 mining operations, and one rather lovely vacation planet, where the indigenous population had been so grateful for their relocation bonuses that they'd sent thank you cards for 6 generations running, which is why nobody in the consortium's boardroom was particularly concerned when the Deep Space Survey ship, Profitable Venture, transmitted its findings from the 3rd planet of an unremarkable yellow star in a galactic backwater that most civilized species used primarily as a reference point for middle of nowhere. The planet designation Terra 3, though the locals apparently called it something charmingly primitive like Earth, was an absolute treasure trove. The initial scans revealed iron ore deposits that would make a Durelian mining corporation weep with joy. Rare earth elements scattered across the surface like some cosmic philanthropist had been feeling generous, and enough fresh water to supply a dozen worlds. The biodiversity readings were off the charts, suggesting an ecosystem so robust that it could probably survive whatever industrial extraction methods the Hegemony employed, and still have enough left over to look pretty in the promotional brochure. But the real prize wasn't the resources, it was the natives. According to the Xenobiological Survey, the planet's dominant species had barely achieved nuclear fission, possessed a space program that could generously be described as adorably optimistic, and had somehow managed to avoid developing faster-than-light communication despite having opposable thumbs for several millennia. They were, in the technical terminology favored by Hegemony assessors, hilariously primitive. Better yet, preliminary cultural analysis suggested they were laughably divided among themselves. The surveillance drones had recorded ongoing conflicts over territory, resources, and something called political ideology, a concept so quaint that the Hegemony's xenosociologists had to dust off textbooks from their undergraduate days to remember what it meant. The species that couldn't even agree on how to govern a single planet was hardly likely to present unified resistance to a polite corporate takeover. The psychological profiles were equally encouraging. The humans, as they called themselves with the sort of unimaginative naming convention typical of emerging species, appeared to be driven primarily by emotion rather than logic. They formed attachments to geographical locations for sentimental reasons, valued abstract concepts like freedom over practical considerations like not being extinct, and had an inexplicable tendency to fight over resources instead of simply filling out the proper requisition form. In short, they were exactly the sort of species that made Hegemony operations run smoothly. Emotional beings were predictable. Divided peoples were manageable. Primitive civilizations were grateful for the opportunity to join the galactic community, even if their role in that community was primarily to provide raw materials and stay out of the way. The board meeting to approve Terra 3's acquisition lasted exactly 47 minutes, a new record for efficiency. The relocation budget was set at a generous 15% above minimum standard. The timeline was established at 18 standard months from first contact to full operational status, and the diplomatic team was selected from the consortium's most experienced specialists in primitive species management. Ambassador Nexus, of Orthak, whose credentials included the peaceful acquisition of 6 worlds and a commendation for outstanding achievement and condescension, was chosen to lead the first contact mission. His assistant, a methodical Grelian administrator named Efficient Process, handled the paperwork with the sort of bureaucratic precision that had made the Hegemony famous across 3 spiral arms. The standard diplomatic package was prepared with care, holographic presentations explaining the benefits of Hegemony membership, legal documents outlining the generous terms of planetary lease agreements, and helpful pamphlets describing the amenities available in the various relocation colonies. Everything was translated into the local languages, all 47 of them, because apparently these humans couldn't even agree on how to communicate with each other, which was both inefficient and oddly endearing. As the diplomatic vessel Mutual Benefit prepared for departure to Terra 3, the mood aboard was positively cheerful. The crew looked forward to what promised to be one of the smoothest acquisition operations in Hegemony history. After all, what could possibly go wrong when dealing with a species that hadn't even figured out how to travel between their own star system? In the cargo hold, carefully secured alongside the diplomatic gifts and legal documents, sat the standard contingency equipment that every Hegemony vessel carried: non-lethal suppression devices, atmospheric control systems, and enough firepower to pacify a moderately stubborn colony world. It was all routine procedure, of course, the sort of precautionary measures that any responsible corporation took when dealing with unpredictable primitive species. Nobody aboard the Mutual Benefit expected to need any of the humans, according to every model and simulation, would be far too reasonable to make that necessary. The Mutual Benefit arrived in Earth's solar system on a Tuesday, which was either ironic or prophetic depending on one's perspective regarding humanity's legendary relationship with inconvenient time. The ship positioned itself in what diplomatic protocol deemed the non-threatening but visible orbital zone, close enough to be impressive, far enough to avoid accusations of aggressive posturing, and perfectly positioned to give the humans a good long look at technology that should have them appropriately awed. Ambassador Nexus reviewed his notes one final time as the translation matrices came online. The psychological profiles suggested humans responded well to displays of benevolent authority, so the first contact package had been carefully calibrated to project exactly the right mixture of advanced sophistication and paternal kindness. Think of it as cosmic guidance counselor rather than interstellar repo man. The initial broadcast went exactly according to the handbook. Nexus appeared on every human communication network simultaneously, his image carefully adjusted to seem approachable yet impressive. The universal translator rendered his words into each local language with just enough formal ceremony to convey importance without crossing into pomposity. "Greetings, people of Earth," he began, following the script that had worked on dozens of worlds. "I am Ambassador Nexus of the Hegemony Trade Consortium, representing 47 civilized species in peaceful cooperation across the galaxy. We come to offer your world an unprecedented opportunity to join the galactic community." What happened next was supposed to be awed silence, followed by cautious but excited questions about this magnificent opportunity. Instead, the humans did something that wasn't in any of the protocols. They started talking back immediately, interrupting each other, and asking questions that the diplomatic team's cultural specialists would later describe as aggressively practical. The first response came from a human leader, whose title translated roughly as president of a large geographic area. Instead of expressing gratitude for the opportunity, she asked pointed questions about mining rights, environmental impact assessments, and something called eminent domain laws. Her tone was polite but carried an undertone that the xenolinguistic analysis software flagged as dangerously similar to a predator evaluating prey. Things went downhill from when Nexus explained the generous relocation packages available to displaced populations. A human wearing military insignia asked why relocation was necessary at all. When the ambassador detailed the hegemony's efficient resource extraction methods, an individual identified as a scientist began making calculations about sustainable yield rates and expressing concerns about ecological collapse. Most puzzling of all, when presented with the legal framework for planetary acquisition, the humans produced their own legal documents and started talking about something called sovereignty. The concept didn't translate well. Hegemony databases contained 14 different words for temporary administrative arrangement, 11 terms for resource sharing agreement, and 43 variations on mutually beneficial partnership, but nothing that quite captured what the humans meant when they used this sovereignty word. The cultural analysis team worked frantically to decode what appeared to be an entirely new legal concept, involving the radical notion that inhabitants of a planet might have some sort of inherent right to remain on said planet. By the third day of negotiations, Ambassador Nexus was beginning to understand why primitive species typically required more hands-on management. The humans kept asking uncomfortable questions about things like consent of the governed and right to self-determination, concepts so outdated that most civilized species had evolved past them millennia. Worse, they seemed to be taking detailed notes and consulting with each other in languages the translation matrix couldn't penetrate. Some sort of mathematical notation that their military specialists were using with disturbing frequency. The breaking point came when the humans presented their counter-proposal. Instead of accepting the hegemony's generous offer to lease their planet in exchange for relocation benefits, they suggested an alternative arrangement, wherein the consortium could purchase specific mining rights at market rates, subject to environmental regulations, with all profits above operational costs being shared with the planetary government, and with the understanding that operations could be suspended or terminated at any time if the local population withdrew consent process, whose administrative duties had never before included decoding what amounted to corporate extortion disguised as diplomacy. Spent 6 hours running the numbers before concluding that such an arrangement would reduce projected profits by approximately 90. When he reported this to Ambassador Nexus, the Vorthak's response was unprintable in 17 languages. The situation deteriorated further when the humans began making their own demands. They wanted technology transfers. They wanted representation in galactic affairs. They wanted guarantees about environmental protection that were so comprehensive they would have made a Biolan conservationist weep with joy. Most unreasonably of all, they wanted time to consult with their population about the consortium's offer, as if major corporate decisions should be subject to some sort of democratic process. It was during the 4th day of increasingly absurd negotiations that the humans revealed their masterstroke of primitive cunning. They had been broadcasting the entire diplomatic exchange to their global population, not summaries, not carefully edited highlights, but the complete unfiltered documentation of every conversation, every proposal, and every consortium threat disguised as friendly encouragement. The entire planet was now watching the negotiations with the sort of unified attention that the psychological profiles had deemed impossible for such a fractured species. The response was immediate and clarifying. Humans across their planet began expressing opinions about the consortium's offer, using terms that the translation software flagged with increasingly urgent warning. The xenolinguistic team eventually stopped trying to provide accurate translations, and simply noted that human languages apparently contained a remarkable variety of ways to decline a business proposition. More concerning were the human activities that surveillance drones detected in the wake of the broadcasts. Military installations were increasing their alert status. Industrial facilities were shifting to what appeared to be wartime production schedule. Most puzzling of all, civilian populations were engaging in organized activities that the analysis software couldn't classify as either preparation for evacuation. When Ambassador Nexus raised these concerns with the human diplomatic team, their response was enlightening in the worst possible way. The leader smiled, a facial expression that the cultural database identified as either friendly acknowledgement or predatory warning, depending on context, and said something that the translator rendered as "Oh, that we're just getting ready to discuss your proposal more thoroughly." The tone in which she delivered this statement made efficient processes' primary nervous system twitch in ways that administrative training had never prepared him for. By day 7, it had become clear that the humans were not following any recognizable diplomatic protocol. Instead of negotiating in good faith toward an inevitable acceptance of superior force, they seemed to be treating the entire process as some sort of elaborate game with rules that only they understood. Worse, they appeared to be winning. When the consortium's deadline for accepting the generous offer arrived, the human response was delivered by the same smiling leader who had been causing so much administrative difficulty. Her statement was brief, clear, and translated perfectly into Galactic Standard. "Thank you for your interest in Earth. After careful consideration, we must respectfully decline your proposal. We appreciate the opportunity, but we've decided to retain current management. We hope you understand." What Ambassador Nexus understood was that he now faced a choice between returning to hegemony headquarters to explain how a primitive species had somehow said no to a corporate acquisition, or implementing the contingency measures that no civilized being ever wanted to use. The decision, unfortunately, had already been made for him by the humans' complete failure to behave like conquered primitives should. What followed the humans' polite declination of the consortium's offer was what military historians would later classify as the galaxy's most comprehensive demonstration of why certain species shouldn't be disturbed during their evolutionary development. The hegemony, having never encountered a primitive civilization with the audacity to simply say no thank you to superior technology and overwhelming force, proceeded to implement what they euphemistically called remedial compliance measures. The first lesson began when the consortium deployed their standard intimidation protocol, a demonstration of superior firepower aimed at an uninhabited area to showcase the futility of resistance. The target was a barren asteroid that the humans had been using for mining practice, a perfect example of primitive resource extraction that would soon be rendered obsolete by hegemony efficiency. The asteroid ceased to exist in a brief, brilliant flash that should have sent every human government scrambling to renegotiate surrender terms. Instead, the humans did something that wasn't in any tactical manual. They took note, detailed technical notes about energy output, targeting systems, and what appeared to be reverse engineering calculations. Then they broadcast a response that the translation systems initially flagged as either a formal surrender or a restaurant review. Impressive light show came the message from Earth's primary diplomatic frequency. We rate it 7 out of 10 for visual effects, -2 points for predictability. We've prepared our own demonstration if you're interested in cultural exchange. What happened next would have been hilarious if it weren't so thoroughly impossible according to every model of primitive species behavior in the consortium's databases. The humans launched something from their planet's surface, not a weapon, not a surrender message, but what their communication channels identified as a care package. The package, when intercepted and analyzed, contained items that redefined the hegemony's understanding of psychological warfare. There were food samples from Earth's various cultures, each one more complex and flavorful than anything in the consortium's standard nutrition supplements. There were artistic works that displayed a sophistication of thought that supposedly primitive species weren't capable of producing. Most unsettling of all, there were mathematical proofs that solved several problems hegemony scientists had been working on for decades. Attached to the care package was a note that the translation system rendered with increasing uncertainty. We thought you might be homesick. Also, we fixed some of your math. You're welcome. P.S. That asteroid you destroyed? We were done with it anyway. Thanks for the cleanup. Ambassador Nexus stared at the message for what efficient process later calculated as 17 minutes of absolute silence before ordering the deployment of suppression drone. If the humans wanted to play games with superior technology, the consortium would demonstrate exactly how those games ended. The drone's sleek, efficient machines designed to pacify unruly populations through non-lethal but highly persuasive electromagnetic pulses descended toward Earth's major population centers with the sort of methodical precision that had convinced 43 previous species to reconsider their negotiating positions. They made it approximately halfway through Earth's atmosphere before humanity provided its second educational demonstration. The drones didn't explode, didn't crash, and didn't malfunction. They simply stopped working and began broadcasting what appeared to be Earth's popular music back to the mutual benefit. The playlist, according to the Xena cultural analysis team, seemed to focus heavily on themes of resistance, defiance, and something called rock and roll, which the database classified as either a geological process or a mating ritual. More concerning than the musical selection was the technical impossibility of what had just occurred. The suppression drones were equipped with hardened systems specifically designed to resist electronic warfare from civilizations up to Class 7 technological development. Earth barely qualified as Class 2. The explanation came in another message from the human diplomatic team, delivered with the same cheerful politeness that was beginning to make Ambassador Nexus's secondary nervous system develop what hegemony medical staff would diagnose as aggressive anxiety disorder. We hope you enjoyed our radio programming. Your drones are very nice, by the way. We've made some improvements to their software. They should be much more efficient now. Consider it a thank you gift for sharing your technology. When the drones returned to the mutual benefit, they carried modifications that the consortium's engineering team would later describe as impossible, brilliant, and absolutely terrifying. The humans had not only reverse-engineered hegemony technology in a matter of hours, they had improved it using principles that didn't exist in any known physics database. Efficient Processes report on the incident was a masterpiece of administrative understatement. The natives appeared to possess unexpected technical capabilities. The situation escalated when the consortium deployed their heavy compliance measure. Military vessels, fresh from successful operations on 3 other worlds, arrived in Earth's solar system with enough firepower to sterilize continents and enough legal documentation to justify it under 17 different articles of hegemony acquisition law. The humans' response to this overwhelming display of force was to invite the consortium to a conference. Not surrender negotiations, not emergency capitulation protocols. A conference, with an agenda, and refresh. The agenda, when translated, included items such as discussion of mutual interests, technology sharing opportunities, cultural exchange programs, and alternative dispute resolution methods. It was the sort of document that civilized species produced when they were beginning profitable partnerships, not when they were facing obliteration. Most disturbing of all was the final agenda item: demonstration of Earth's commitment to peaceful coexistence. Ambassador Nexus, whose diplomatic training had covered every conceivable form of primitive species behavior from suicidal defiance to immediate surrender, found himself in the unprecedented position of having to improvise. The humans weren't following any known pattern. They weren't even following any unknown patterns. They appeared to be creating entirely new patterns as they went along. Against his better judgment, he accepted the conference invitation. The meeting location was a space station that the humans claimed to have constructed in the past week. This was obviously impossible, since their technological surveys clearly showed Earth lacked the industrial capacity for orbital construction projects. The humans must be lying, or engaging in some primitive form of psychological manipulation. The space station that greeted the mutual benefit was definitely not a primitive psychological manipulation. It was a marvel of engineering that incorporated design principles from at least 12 different galactic civilizations, power systems that improved on hegemony standards by 30%, and defensive capabilities that made Ambassador Nexus's threat assessment software emit sounds that administrative protocol had no procedures for addressing. When questioned about the station's impossible construction timeline, the human representative smiled that predatory-friendly smile and said something that the translation system rendered as, "We had some help from your drones. They were very educational." It was at this moment that Ambassador Nexus began to suspect that the consortium's assessment of human intelligence might have been slightly inaccurate. The conference aboard humanity's impossible space station lasted exactly 43 minutes, which was precisely long enough for Ambassador Nexus to realize that every assumption the hegemony had made about Earth was not just wrong, but catastrophically, spectacularly, universe-alteringly incorrect. The meeting room itself was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, disguised as hospitality. The furniture was clearly designed for human physiology, but somehow perfectly accommodated every species represented on the mutual benefits crew. The refreshments included delicacies that shouldn't have existed outside of specialized agricultural worlds, prepared with techniques that required technology the humans supposedly didn't possess. Most unnerving of all, the background music was an orchestral arrangement of the same songs the hijacked drones had been broadcasting, performed with a sophistication that suggested Earth's primitive civilization had been developing advanced cultural expressions for considerably longer than anyone had calculated. The human representative, a woman whose smile had evolved from merely predatory to something approaching cosmically amused, began the proceedings with an announcement that redefined Nexus's understanding of diplomatic catastrophe. "We've been reviewing your business model," she said, consulting notes written in what the translation software identified as 17 different human languages, plus 4 that appeared to be entirely new mathematical notation systems. "It's fascinating from an anthropological perspective. You've essentially created a galactic protection racket, haven't you? Efficient processes administrative database crashed, trying to process the implications of a primitive species accurately diagnosing 3 centuries of hegemony expansion policy in a single sentence. What followed was less a negotiation than a comprehensive dismantling of everything the consortium thought it knew about interstellar relations. The humans had not only analyzed hegemony operations across 47 worlds, they had contacted the displaced populations of every single acquisition, and offered them something the civilized galaxy had never conceived of: legal representation. "You see," the human continued, still maintaining that terrifying smile, We have this concept called class action lawsuit. It's quite useful when dealing with organizations that engage in systematic fraud across multiple jurisdictions. The legal documents she presented made Ambassador Nexus's translation software emit distress signals. The humans had somehow acquired copies of every hegemony acquisition contract for the past century, cross-referenced them with something called interstellar maritime law, and discovered what they politely termed actionable violations of basic sentient rights across multiple star systems. Worse, they had filed these legal challenges, not just in human courts, but in the judicial systems of 12 other galactic civilizations that the hegemony had somehow never realized were paying attention to their expansion activity. The lawsuits demanded restitution, damages, and what the translation system could only render as punitive measures, designed to prevent future corporate malfeasance. But legal challenges, however comprehensive, were still just paperwork. What transformed mere bureaucratic nightmare into existential crisis was humanity's demonstration of their commitment to peaceful coexistence. The demonstration began when every hegemony facility within 50 light-years of Earth simultaneously received unexpected visitors. Not invaders, not conquerors, but what the humans cheerfully described as technical consultants. These consultants had arrived in ships that incorporated design elements from every piece of hegemony technology they had encountered, improved with engineering principles that made the consortium's best scientists weep with professional envy. The consultants had not attacked anyone, had not destroyed anything, and had not even issued demands. They had simply arrived, announced their presence, and begun offering efficiency improvements to hegemony operations. Mining facilities found their extraction rates increased by 300%, while environmental damage dropped to virtually zero. Administrative centers discovered their paperwork processing speeds enhanced beyond anything corporate efficiency experts had dreamed possible. Even military installations were politely offered upgrades that would make their defensive capabilities more appropriate for civilized galactic relations. The upgrades were, technically, completely voluntary. The human consultants were perfectly willing to leave if asked. The problem was that the upgrades were so obviously superior to existing hegemony technology that refusing them would have been professional suicide for any facility administrator with career ambition. Within 72 hours, the consortium discovered that their entire operational infrastructure had been quietly and politely revolutionized by a species they had dismissed as primitive 3 weeks earlier. The final lesson came when Ambassador Nexus attempted to contact hegemony headquarters for emergency instructions on handling the Earth situation. The response he received redefined his understanding of cosmic irony. Hegemony Command had spent the past week in intensive negotiations with what they described as an extremely advanced civilization that has expressed interest in mutually beneficial trade relationship. This civilization had demonstrated technological capabilities that surpassed hegemony standards, cultural sophistication that impressed even the most xenophobic council members, and diplomatic skills that had turned what should have been a standard first contact scenario into the most profitable partnership opportunity in consortium history. The advanced civilization was, of course, humanity. While Ambassador Nexus had been struggling with Earth's primitive resistance, human diplomatic teams had bypassed the consortium entirely and negotiated directly with the galactic governments that the hegemony supposedly represented. They had offered technology transfers, cultural exchanges, and economic partnerships that made the consortium's resource extraction model look like what it actually was: an expensive, inefficient method of accomplishing what could be done better through simple cooperation. The final message from Hegemony Command was brief and professionally devastating. Consortium operations in the Sol system are hereby discontinued. Ambassador Nexus and crew are reassigned to administrative duties pending corporate restructuring. Earth has been designated a priority diplomatic partner. Try not to embarrass the organization further. As the mutual benefit prepared to depart Earth's solar system, Ambassador Nexus found himself contemplating the sort of career change that involved as much distance as possible from anything resembling interstellar diplomacy. Efficient Process had already submitted his resignation and was reportedly considering a position in municipal waste management, which he claimed would involve less exposure to impossible situations. The human representative's final message to the departing consortium vessel was delivered with the same cheerful courtesy that had characterized the entire interaction. Thank you for visiting Earth. We hope you've learned something valuable about the importance of asking before you safe travels, and please feel free to visit again once you've developed a more sustainable business model. Attached to the message was a gift package containing detailed technical specifications for the improvements humanity had made to hegemony technology, a comprehensive economic analysis of why cooperative trade was more profitable than resource extraction, and a recipe for something called chocolate chip cookies that the food analysis team would later describe as proof that some species are simply too dangerous. As Earth receded in the mutual benefits view screen, Ambassador Nexus reflected on the cosmic justice of the situation. The hegemony had come to Earth seeking to acquire a world's wealth through the application of superior force and technology. They had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, just not in the way anyone had intended. The humans had indeed given them their world's wealth. They had shared their technology, their culture, their knowledge and their resources, with a generosity that shamed 3 centuries of galactic civilization. The price for this unprecedented bounty was merely that the recipients learned to ask politely, instead of demanding, to cooperate instead of dominate, and to recognize that true wealth came not from what could be taken, but from what could be built together. It was Ambassador Nexus had to admit exactly what the consortium had asked for. They had wanted Earth's riches, and they had received them in abundance. The fact that accepting these gifts required abandoning everything the hegemony thought it knew about interstellar relations was simply the cost of doing business with a species that had spent their entire evolutionary history learning that the best way to survive predators was to become something even more dangerous. The galaxy would never be quite the same, but then again, that had always been humanity's specialty.